Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We are going to start promptly in 2 minutes to let a few more attendees dial into today's episode. We'll see you in 2 minutes.
I feel like Liz and I should have some witty banter here for everyone to listen to. You don't have to do anything to make it start recording, right? It automatically does that.
That is correct. This presentation will be recorded and available afterwards, and you'll hear more about that in a moment from Kelly.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Observability Maturity, a framework and model presentation. Thank you for joining to today's webinar. Before we dive into our presentation, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions at any time during this webinar, please use the Ask a Question tab located below your player. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation to address any and all questions. Also, at the end of the webinar, we would really appreciate if you would rate our presentation and provide feedback using the Rate This tab below the player. Your feedback makes us better. If you have any technical difficulties at all, down at the bottom of the page, you can click on Support for Viewers. Finally, today's presentation is being recorded and will be available at the same URL shortly after its conclusion. Feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. Let me introduce you to today's speakers. Presenting today, we have Charity Majors, CTO and co-founder of Honeycomb, and Liz Fong-Jones, Honeycomb's Principal Developer Advocate. Charity, why does observability matter?
Oh, that's a great question, Kelly. Thank you. You will notice that my voice is gone. I don't know where it went. I hope it's having a nice time on the desert island, perhaps. So instead of a conversation between Liz and I, a lot of this is going to be Liz talking and me kind of doing mime gestures to cheer her on. Why observability matters? It matters because it has to matter, right? Like I've been on call for systems since I was 17. I thought that monitoring would take me forever, right? I thought that I knew how to build systems and maintain them. And then like microservices happen, and then like distributed systems happen, and suddenly I realized that the unknown unknowns way outstrip the known unknowns, and I was just dying. And that's imagery. And I'm now going to drink some of my wonderful lemon tea and let Liz take it from here.
Lovely. Thank you for introducing us to this subject, Charity. So as we were talking about earlier, observability really matters for running sustainable software systems that drive your business. So today's agenda really focuses on these 6 things: why we should care about observability, why you need a maturity model to think about your observability journey, how we think about observability and how we've seen it implemented in organizations, and then we'll help you think about how can you evaluate these things, how can you put this into practice, and what our next steps are for kind of more popularizing the idea of the observability maturity model. And then finally, there will be an opportunity for you to ask us questions at the end, as well as for you to get involved with our future efforts around the maturity model. So let's go ahead and start by talking about the idea that observability is essential to modern software development. So I think that observability is essential because we really have systems that are becoming more and more complex. And as our systems become more and more complex, some of it is essential complexity, which is required to build these more complicated things that we need to deliver value. But some of it is complexity that's not essential. So kind of figuring out which one is which and helping us figure out how do we understand our systems even as the complexity grows. That's kind of the new challenge of software engineering in 2019. So if you have
ownership, right, Liz? Like the fact that ownership is now, like we used to have two teams, dev and ops, and we had different tools, spoke different languages. And if you tried to do both, it was like doing two jobs. And now we've realized that in order to build good services, you have to own them from end to end.
I definitely think so. Slow feedback loops. We cannot afford different sets of tooling because we need to move fast. We need to move really fast, and that's kind of why we think what the observability story is about. But you know, that leads to the next question of why a model, right? Like, why are we doing this model? Why are we doing this today? And I think that part of this answer is that when we have people like who are persistently asking Charity and me, like, you know, all of this observability stuff sounds great, but I could never do it, right? Like my organization is just incapable of doing it. And we kind of want to disabuse you of that notion because we did learn many of these lessons the hard way ourselves. And we don't want you to have to suffer through this, right? We want you to see a path or a set of paths that are feasible for you that other people have walked before and that you can walk as well. So it's not just about, you know, immediately getting to the end, right? Like we have to think about what does the journey look like? How do you progress along this path? How do you know whether you're on a good path or whether you're wandering off into the woods? And this really gets to a lot of the Agile movement as well, about thinking about how do we introduce incremental changes to our organizations and to our development processes, and how do we evaluate, and how do we kind of have that feedback loop for our own processes, as well as injecting feedback loops into our development process itself. So kind of the meta loop of thinking about how do we iterate on our process. So when we sat down to think about this, when we sat down to think about how can we come up with a maturity model for observability, I think that a lot of the challenge was realizing that there are so many different places that people start from. There are so many different places that people start from, and there are so many different ways of accomplishing this goal that we didn't really feel like it was right for us to prescribe one golden path for people. And it wasn't right for us to prescribe kind of one set of evaluation criteria for people. So instead, what we realized was that the idea of Wardley, Simon Wardley, value chain mapping was a really powerful concept. And that the idea of Wardley value chain mapping is that it's something that carries over very well between organizations, but it has to be customized for each organization, that it's a judgment call that people on the ground in each organization need to make. And that it's a framework for thinking about how am I best serving my customers today, right? How am I helping my customers and helping my business and helping my key stakeholders achieve what they're aiming for? And that really resonated with Charity and me. It really resonated the idea that we could think about, you know, instead of saying, thou shalt do, you know, logs in a certain fashion, or thou shalt keep your data stored in a certain way, or thou shalt instrument a certain way. Instead of saying that, we said, you know what, let's zoom out. What are people trying to accomplish, and how can observability help them? And what we wound up with was something that looks vaguely like this, right? Right, like completely beautiful, right? Like starting from the idea of, if you want to make your customers happy, how do you do that? Well, in order to make your customers happy, you need to ship the product, and you need to make sure it's appropriately reliable. But how do you do each of those things, right? And kind of fractally breaking it all down. Fractally breaking it all down to figure out kind of like, how do I start from making the customers happy, and how do I translate that through each step and each individual process to figure out how do we improve? Which components do people need to think about as they're listing out what things might I want to improve upon?
It reminds me of Tolstoy, how he said like every happy house looks the same, and every unhappy family is like looks unique, right? Like everybody has their unique set of pathologies, their unique set of differentiators, and you cannot prescribe a certain route to anyone. And yet, there is this concept of what does a good engineering team look like? What does a high quality engineering team that is shipping fast, that is winning, what does that look like? And how can you get from wherever it is that you are to be more like that?
Yeah, so that's definitely where we were coming from when we started approaching this. And the cool thing about Wardley maps is that they let you focus on kind of not just where are you now, but how can you make each of these pieces evolve over time? How can we move along this path to make ourselves more mature or more capable? And what blockers might we have to resolve? What's most important? Having a map tailored to your business really, really matters for these purposes. So with that, we can now kind of talk a little bit about the capability model that we developed and thinking about what are the 5 things that every software organization needs to do and how does observability intersect with those. So let's go ahead and talk about and show you what this looks like. So as far as the observability maturity and capabilities, we said everyone here on this call presumably has a business that they care about. But in order for the business to be successful, we said you need to make sure that your development organization is happy. If your development organization is not happy, then they're not going to be as productive as they could be. And I know that when I talked to Cherry about this, she had a bunch of really great thoughts about kind of what makes for a successful engineering team with her previous hat as an engineering director.
Yeah, it's miserable people don't build great systems. Engineering is such a creative act, right? Like we're not used to thinking of engineering as a creative job, but it so is, especially when you're getting into the edges, right? Anytime you're doing something new, anytime you're doing something that, you know, is pushing the envelope. And to be fair, like 90% of what we do is boring, right? That's fine. Like we can stamp stuff out by rote, but on a regular basis, we encounter new, hard, interesting problems, and we can't solve them without a creative brain. And a creative brain is well rested. A creative brain is not bogged down in minutiae, things that you're repeating over and over. A creative brain has a certain amount of freedom, right, to pursue whatever their curiosity is piqued by. Because the greatest way to feed a creative brain is to give it some play, right? Your work should feel like play. And like debugging to me, like the best times in my life that I've debugged the hardest problems, it felt like I was playing, right?
Yeah, it definitely goes to a lot of what you've said about autonomy, mastery, purpose, and all of these wonderful things that we really know make for successful engineering teams.
We're not used to knitting these together. We're not used to saying no. Like our technical competence depends on our care and feeding as human beings. But I think it's so true.
Yeah, but then there's also another piece, right? Like you can have all the happy devs in the world, but if they're not working on the problems that your customers actually care about, then you're not really having a successful, you're not really having a successful organization. So those were kind of the first 2 ways that we broke it down, is are your dev teams happy? Are your customers being served? If you're not accomplishing those 2 things, then we'd argue that your organization is not actually successful. But that's really hard to concretize, right? Like it's really hard to conceptualize what are the things that I should be working on, right? Like, so we realized that we had to get a little bit more fine-grained than that. So we went on and said, and we'll talk about each of these things in detail, but we said there are 5 key capabilities that every team needs to think about. And these 5 key capabilities are ultimately backed by, do you have the ability to collect the data that you need? And do you have the ability to query it to answer your questions? So let's go ahead and talk about kind of each of these 5 areas, and then let's talk about kind of how the instrumentation and querying pieces, which a lot of people jump to right away when they think about observability. At the end, we'll talk a little bit about kind of how that last piece helps you in each of the 5 areas, but we really didn't want to focus on how you solve the problems. We want to focus on what are the problems and why. So let's start talking about what quality code is, right? You need to have quality code in order to have a successful engineering organization and have happy customers. Because if you don't actually have quality code, then what happens is your users complain that the product is buggy, and your developers really get frustrated that their builds don't pass, that they can't actually get anywhere in the code base because they're constantly firefighting trying to figure out why is this freaking software not working. So that's kind of where we come from as far as thinking about what is quality code and how does it really advance both of these missions. There's also the idea
that, like, quality code is not sometimes the right thing to do is to take a shortcut, right? The right thing to do is not always to refactor and so forth, because maybe this piece of code has a short lifetime. That's up to you to decide. You know your workload better than we do.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. And I think the other purpose of talking about these 5 capability areas is all of them are areas that you can think about. Not all of them will be equally important to your business at any moment, right? This is to kind of prime you to think about what is the area that's going to have the most impact for my business right now. So let's go ahead and move on to talking about predictable releases. I think that predictable releases are another key cornerstone of making your customers and making your devs happy, because devs really get frustrated if they commit a change, right? Like they think something shipped and it actually doesn't reach production, doesn't actually reach customers until months later. And unfortunately, that's the reality that a lot of people live with. And we're trying to tell you here, it doesn't have to be that way. And you can incrementally decrease the time between when someone commits a change and when it's really delivered, when it's actually delivered and deemed stable enough that it's not being rolled back. And from a customer perspective,
go ahead, Liz.
And from a customer perspective, right, like, you know, a feature request, 6 months for it to be delivered, even though it's sitting in someone's code repo somewhere, that's a really intensely frustrating experience for you. Go ahead, Charity.
I was going to say, if anyone's read Accelerate and the research that Nicole and Jez have been doing, they get very frustrated with the idea of what does a good performing team look like, and they finally brought it down to one thing. You can pretty much tell how good a team is by the amount of time it takes between when you write the code and when it shows up in production live. Like, that is the one identifying factor. Like, if you can shorten that, so many virtuous cycles feed in, because it's not a trade-off between speed and accuracy. They actually reinforce each other. When you get better at speed, you get better at success. When you get better at success, you get better at speed. Like, these reinforce each other. They're not in tension, which is how we intuitively think about it. And we have to start training ourselves and our peers and our leadership out of thinking that way, because our tendency to clench when there's a problem is the problem.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, right? Like, we talk about the idea of reducing these development cycle times so that you get that feedback, so you can actually hear from your customers, which we'll talk about more in a moment. I think there's another piece here that we think about as far as a capability, and I think that there's a reason I don't mention it first, right? Resilience is a thing that you need in your socio-technical systems. You need the adaptive capacity of the team and the service that they're supporting together such that you can run it sustainably for a long time with acceptable levels of reliability. But a lot of people, when they think about observability, think first about incident response. I think the story starts long before that, right? That incident response is one piece, but kind of you also have to set up all of these other factors that you have to really, yeah, like you cannot have that, right? Like preventative care versus emergency room, exactly as Charity was saying, right? Like, I think that that's so critical, and I think that that's something that we need people to think about the larger picture of what does resilience in my organization look like? And no, resilience is not just a property of your code, right? Resilience is a property of the people in combination with the code. So if you don't have good operational resilience, then what winds up happening is your outages happen, right? And outages inevitably happen, and they take longer to resolve, right? In some cases, right, outages can even go on for days, weeks, months. In the case of healthcare.gov, right? If you don't understand your systems, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and the worst ones are the ones that go on for days or weeks or months, and you don't even know about them. Like, they're hurting your customers every day. People are bouncing, people are unhappy, but like a very small percentage of the people who are suffering actually trickle up to you.
Yeah, so kind of connecting that feedback loop is super, super important. And speaking of connecting that feedback loop together, right, like, I think we take a really broad view of what user insight is, right? We take a broad view of thinking about how do you not just empower your software engineers or the people who happen to be on call, who ideally should be your set of software engineers, right? Like, how do you get everyone, including product managers, software development, product engineers, and system right? Do we have product market fit? So if you don't have these things, then what winds up happening is you wind up wasting a whole bunch of people's time, right? And your company goes under if you don't actually understand what is the market demanding of me. I think that this is something that Charity definitely cares about a whole bunch as someone who was on the kind of operations and product sides at Parse before. I don't know whether you want to share an anecdote.
Oh, God. Oh, sure. Yeah, at Parse, I remember back into the service, right? And so every day people are coming to me and they're like, Parse is down. I feel like Parse is not down. Like, look at all my dashboards, they're all green, right? Because maybe it's Disney, and Disney is doing like, 30 requests per second. Mobile traffic is huge. And it's their world to them. Like if you're an indie app developer, your app is your world. Like if it isn't performing well, you aren't getting paid, your users are pissed, they're all coming at you. But to me, it was one of like 100,000. By the time I looked, it was one of a million, right? Like I can't care about every one of the million apps equally. I would go insane. I would kill myself trying.
But also you had the thing going on, right? Like people found weird and wacky ways to use Parse that you weren't necessarily aware of, right?
Because everyone is a platform. And I believe that platforms, like from a backend engineer's perspective, a platform is nothing other than a system where you're inviting your users' chaos to live on your land. and the more control and flexibility you give your users over what the hell they want to do, whether that's writing like ad hoc queries or like running snippets of code versus like testable outcomes, right? Like the more flexibility and power you give your users, the happier they are. But the more they can screw you over, and the more they will be unique, and no two snowflakes will ever happen the same way twice. They come up with, humans are just little chaos monsters. The more you give your users the ability to do things, the more everything becomes a one-off.
Yeah, I totally hear that, right? And it goes to the idea that if you don't have that ability to understand what your users are doing, then you're not going to be able to build correctly for them. They're going to be hacking onto your system and you'll have no control over it. Whereas the more that you understand your users, the more you can give them a paved path that they really will be happy with.
That is true. But also, if your business, if what makes you a business is that you do give your users that crazy amount of control, maybe that's fine. Maybe that's the decision that you make. Then you need the ability to post-talk, understand, right? Like this is what like Travis and Jenkins and all the big CI providers, they let you do whatever the fuck you want basically on your instance, but they regularly have to go, this is infinitely long thin tail of things that almost never happen, and that's all you have to care about, right? So you don't care about the health of the system in aggregate. You care about each and every single user as it's making its way through all of your code and being able to understand exactly what happened for every single one of them.
Yeah, and that brings us to the really great point next that we want to focus our users, our customers, and the general observability community on, which is how does observability interact with technical debt, right? The more code you pile on, right, like how do you actually make sure that we can continue to make forward progress? How do we make the right trade-offs so that we don't, spend forever in decision paralysis, while at the same time cleaning up as we go so that people can understand the systems, so that people can really understand, like, hey, this is what the system is currently doing. This is how I can make progress. This is how I can improve without fearing that I'm going to break the whole system. And my former colleague from Google, John Reese, talks a lot about this idea of the haunted graveyard, of the thing no one wants to touch because they don't understand it. And that to me is an insidious form of technical debt.
Yes, the black box. It's something scary living there. I just started watching Stranger Things, so now I'm like, it's the upside down place. Nobody go there. Yeah, and the thing is that like you need to have a toolbox for digging your way out of these holes until it's no longer scary. And that starts with instrumentation. Instrumentation is your ears, your eyes, your nose, your tongue. It is your five senses for understanding the code that you're writing and shipping every day. And I feel like as an industry, we're kind of behind here. We've gotten really good about commenting our code. We've gotten really good about, there's some rigor around a lot of these things. Even documentation, I think we're better at documentation. I know this is a big, scary, stupid statement. We're better at documentation than we are at instrumentation. Because for so long, we've been shaping our instrumentation to fit the needs of the very hyper-specific data structures that certain tools have been giving us, instead of starting first with what will I need to understand these problems, and then just shoving it off for future analysis.
Yeah, awesome. So those are kind of the 5 areas. And as Charlie was alluding to, when we have the idea of instrumentation, right, I think that instrumentation is needed, but it's not instrumentation because we like to write instrumentation, right? There's a purpose. We need to get the critical data we need to answer those 5 questions. We need the critical data that we need in order to understand, do you have quality code? Is a release going to happen on time? Are you able to debug your system in production? Are you able to understand your users? Are you able to maintain your code without technical debt, right? Like, that's why we write instrumentation, so that we can get the data that we need and get the context that we need in order to answer these questions.
And this is both for humans to be reading and for systems to be reading. Like, machines need to be consuming and doing like some sort of alpha analysis of things machines are good at. But you know what humans are good at? Taking that original intent that you had and looking at the system and seeing if it's doing what you meant it to, and if anything else looks weird. And that is something that you and only you can do that. And you're going to have forgotten what that original intent was in a few hours or days, right? So this is a rare, precious moment in time where you've built something, committed it, and it's deploying, and you get to watch it and validate it. And I swear to God, 80 to 90% of technical problems in production will never even be noticed by your users if your engineers just get in the habit, muscle memory of doing that.
Yeah, and I think that the other aspect of this, besides kind of the muscle memory of watching your code as it goes out to production, is also being unafraid to ask new questions, right? Being unafraid not just to accept this is what's on our dashboards, but also kind of thinking about how can I make sure that if I'm trying to understand the system from first principles, or if I'm trying to put together these new set of fields they've never put together before, right, to understand what combination of build IDs and users is tripping this bug, right? Like, those are the things that you need to be able and empowered to ask rather than kind of falling back on, well, there's no dashboard for it, I guess I better bug an expert, right? You are the expert.
And honestly, this makes you a better engineer. It really does. Like, when you're passively like just kind of pattern matching between dashboards in your code, you're not actively engaging with the subject matter, and it can be very daunting to make that leap to actually formulating a question, looking for the hypothesis, and testing it or not. But this is how I see people become really great senior engineers, and it's important to know how your code runs in production under normal circumstances, not just during outages.
Yeah. So we put out this idea of those 5 key capabilities in the instrumentation and data and querying that drives your ability to answer those 5 capabilities. And we put it out and we weren't sure what people would think. Honestly, like Cherry and I are very opinionated, and sometimes people disagree with us, and that's fine, right? But what we heard when we put together this meetup, what we heard when we put together this meetup that had, I think, something like 30 people there at O'Reilly VelocityConf in San Jose, was people really resonated, right? Like, this idea of these 5 things that people care about as engineers, that was something that really resonated with our audience, that people really felt, yes, this describes exactly what my organization is going through, and maybe one of these is more painful to us than the other. Like, in particular, 2 of the tables had the highest attendance, right? The technical debt and the operational resilience tables, right? People really strongly identified with those 2 being their most painful, but everyone felt affinity with each of these 5 areas. And what we did was we had a really great set of roundtable discussions about each of these topics.
Yeah, observability is such a keystone. It's a cornerstone for each of these. Like, it's almost, it's not the point, it is the how, right? It's not the what, but it's the how you get there. And I feel like there are many axes in which our industry has been kind of held back by the fact that we haven't had observability tooling. By that I mean just the ability to understand on a per request level what is happening, what is the context, being able to slice and dice over the wall, letting someone else in ops look at these aggregate graphs, and having no idea if this spike means that, you know, my SQL is slow, or 10% of users are affected, or 1% of users are completely failing, or, you know, all of these very different scenarios. I think that chaos engineering has started to become a thing because observability is starting to become a thing. I think that there are a lot of things that are becoming feasible because of observability, and so, like, I don't honestly like to focus on observability so much as I like to focus on these actual questions that like Liz was just saying, like we had these discussions. And all these people have these really rich, challenging problems, and observability is just like a missing ingredient every time. And it's not the only one, which is why it's not the only thing that we talk about. But it's kind of a prerequisite. It's like English 101 when you get to college. You got to take it before you can take anything else.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Like Ben Siegelman from Lightstep, right, often talks about the idea of traces are the fuel, right? Events are the fuel, right? That you use the instrumentation you collect in order to answer these questions. And if you lack the ability to answer those questions, then you're going to be in trouble, right? You're not going to be able to answer questions like, is my deploy pipeline getting slower over time? What's contributing to my deploy pipeline getting slower? Or what set of users is tripping this?
And this manifests a lot of these social pathologies that we're all familiar with, like the grumpy old guy in the corner who nobody can fire because he can intuitively understand all these problems from this complex system that nobody else can understand because it's not in a tool anywhere. No one has access to it. It's in someone's head, you know. Or like the shepherding, the hoarding of information, or the not sure. So there are so many pathologies that we think of as being social problems. But like we said, they're technical social systems, and there's a lot of crossover. And just opening this lens on the production, making it freely available to everyone, has a great democratizing effect.
Yeah, so definitely one of the themes that we were talking about when we had these tables at O'Reilly Velocity was we had everyone from each of these tables collect notes and kind of record what was the discussion of the table and how did people think that observability mattered, right? And one of the things that came up, for instance, at the operational resilience and incident response table was people really felt that they needed service level objectives to understand in a sufficiently complex distributed system, is the system up or down, right? The answer is yes, the system is up or down, right? There's no binary up or down anymore, right? Like you need to have an idea of what is a sufficiently good state, what's slightly degraded, and what's really too degraded, right? And that if people don't have the visibility into their systems to understand at the event level what's going on, if they can't break that down, then they're going to be in trouble. And no, AI ops is not going to solve your problem, right? That the better path is to have humans be aided by machines rather than tell humans what. From the attendees, right? Like not necessarily even just us like lecturing the crowd, right? Like this is what people said. These are our real problems right now in our organizations.
They're getting very cynical about that, which I love.
Yeah, and then the other area that was super popular that there were a lot of detailed notes on was the idea of technical debt, right? Like the idea of how do we manage our technical debt and complexity? And people mentioned a lot of symptoms of pain. They felt all of this pain because they had projects that literally couldn't move forward because of technical debt, or people were adopting the system for the wrong purpose and running it into the ground. Or there were people where there were recurring problems because people weren't able to effectively communicate, where people weren't able to effectively say, yes, I feel comfortable releasing this because everyone was afraid to touch it. One person at my table even said, like, I literally cannot go on vacation, right? Because people will not be able to push code without me.
It's so sad.
So terrifying and sad, right? These are the problems that people are grappling with, and we really think that observability helps you with this by demystifying production, by making it possible to understand your production systems without relying on that one engineer, to document things through your observability, and to really kind of
guessing.
Yeah, I love that idea.
So that the person who has the most political clout wins. Like, solve arguments with data. All right, I'm getting very excited. Keep going.
And then there were a couple of other tables that I think, Charity, would you like to summarize these?
Yeah, totally. The quality code one, you know, there's a lot of like religious doctrines that build up around code, I think. And in the absence of an arbiter, which is reality, you can get again into all these pathologies of, you know, people's pet ways of liking to do things. But like in the end, our engineering labor serves the business purpose. They're not getting paid to sit around and work on our Vim files, right? You know, we're getting paid to deliver value, and this can get very muddled sometimes. But honestly, people are happier at work when it's clear what the business value that they're trying to create is, and when code quality can be, in reality, it's really good. Nobody writes code and then like ships it and feels confident about it, right? No, I hope not. Shouldn't feel confident about it for quite some time. Observability can answer that question. The predictable release, you've all heard me ranting about Friday deploys, one diff per deploy, decouple deploys from releases. Own your code, right? Anyone who has the ability to merge to master should have the ability to ship their own deploy. Context is key, user insight, and this is one of the most interesting things I think, which is that observability is not just for engineering teams. It is for engineering teams, but it is also for every adjacent team to engineering. Everyone who ever files a ticket for an engineer, everyone who ever asks a question for an engineer, the engineer has to go through, look through code and data and stuff. That should be available to them so that they can serve it up for themselves without having to go through that engineering gatekeeper.
Yeah, so that was a summary of the discussion that we had at one event. But what we're hoping to do is to have more discussions like this, right? Like a representative sample of the 30 most passionate people at Velocity is not necessarily going to be everyone across the world. So we're hoping to continue these conversations. But one of the key venues that we've had a lot of feedback from is from Twitter. A lot of people talk to Charity and me on Twitter, and surprisingly to us, we didn't really get flamed over these, right? Like people just really thought this really resonates with me, to the point that people are asking us for merch with the model, which is like, oh my God, I can sell merch around this.
Yeah, so we want to have more of these conversations. We want to start running them in other towns. We want to continue working on this framework for observability. We'd love to hear from you. Like if you start trying to follow these recommendations, that we just loved it. If you're local, live in New York, I'm in San Francisco, and like I feel very strongly that we only move this industry forward by telling stories and really listening to each other.
Yeah, people really love anecdotes, right? Anecdotes and tales of here's how I solved these pains. And especially, right, like, here's how I applied observability, right? Even if people don't necessarily think technical debt and observability go together, guess what, right? Like, if you hear that story of the team that applied observability in order to decrease the onboarding time of their engineers, or the team that solved their resilience problems with observability, right? Like, these are all things that we can use to help each other advance. So the next steps are
to make all of the mistakes individually over again. We should be able to learn from each other, God hope.
Yeah, right. Like, don't learn from falling face first in everything, right? Other people have fallen face first. Let's leverage each other's knowledge. So the next steps are like, please read our observability model framework, including some things like this is what good looks like, this is what bad looks like, and kind of how do you think about prioritizing these things? These are all things that we're hoping for your feedback on, and also your personal experiences. We're also going to have a survey really soon that will help you kind of contribute your thoughts on this and help us understand where are people along each of these dimensions, because, in order to really figure out how do we give people targeted advice that helps you where they are now, we need to know where you are.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have a few more in-person meetups. So we're going to have some in-person meetups in San Francisco next month. And I'm also hoping to run a meetup in New York, where I'm based, in the coming months as well. And we have
join you for that.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of great episodes of Observability Cast coming out in the next few months, now that both Charity and I are acting as co-hosts of Observability Cast. So we've got great guests like Anna Medina of Gremlin talking about chaos engineering and observability. We've got James from Bugsnag talking about kind of measuring technical debt and code quality. And then we have, who is it from Intercom? Charity.
Rich Archibald.
Rich Archibald from Intercom, who's going to tell us all about how Intercom uses observability to ship software faster, to get their deploys more reliable.
If you know anyone who would be a great guest, or if you yourself would be a good guest, we're always on the lookout, not just backend folks, but client side, mobile developers, even like, product marketing, technical people who use data, who want to talk about this, like hit us up.
So that's effectively most of what we had for you, but we wanted to leave at least 20 minutes at the end for questions. So I think I'm going to hand it over now to Kelly to help us wrap up this, this section of the content.
That sounds wonderful. Now taking questions. If you have any questions, I see a few from our audience. Feel free to enter it into the Ask a Question tab. We'll get to as many as we can during this time. All right, I have a question here that I hope I can do justice to. Someone has asked a question about what we really need to be aiming for. Code freshness, code written, so it's easy to test code written. It's easy to change, limiting the amount of context necessary to understand how a piece of functionality works or fails to. What time spent digging is not time spent understanding. Are these the things we need to be aiming for?
Time spent digging can absolutely be time spent understanding. I don't really understand this question. I think that what I'm hearing is when you're writing code, what should you be paying attention to? And I would say it depends on what's not working for you. I mean, Liz, you have a better idea?
Yeah, I think that this really gets to the idea of toil, right? In the SRE world, we think a lot about toil as time that you're not spending productively working on making strategic improvements to your system. And I think the idea of when you're spending a whole bunch of time scratching your head, not being able to figure out why something works, I think that that's a insidious dark form of technical debt, right? Like it's kind of not necessarily toil in the manual repetitive work sense, but it is toil in the sense of it's something that's slowing you down. It's a form of debt that's dragging you down, that's stopping you from making the changes to your system that you'd really want to. Yeah. So I think that's how I'd look at it is, right, like, you know, asking people, how much of your time are you in the zone? Right, like how much time do you feel like you know what you're doing? How much time are you distracted? And how much time are you just scratching your head being like, WTF is going on?
Yeah, that's a really great point. You should not feel completely unmoored very often. You should feel like you have a place to start, and it may take some persistence, but it's following a trail of breadcrumbs to get you there, right? And if you have the breadcrumbs, the first thing you start doing is gathering the breadcrumbs, which means instrumenting your code and deciding on a framework for that.
Yeah, I think the dangerous thing that happens to a lot of organizations is every new hire relearns these lessons over and over, right? Because no one writes the instrumentation to better understand and document through instrumentation what's going on, right? When you have the same people relearning the same lessons over and over, I think that's really the trap. And the more you kind of free up just a tiny bit of time, right? Every time someone onboards, have them add a little bit of instrumentation, right? You can gradually chip away at this and make the problem better. Feel free to ask another question in the question box if this didn't answer your question.
And when you're on call, just take a instrumentation first approach. Like as you're debugging, instrument 2 yards in front of your eyes at every time, and before long, your entire stack will be well instrumented. Yeah, let's move on.
Well, I think that actually leads into another good question here, and Charity, maybe this is the answer to it. If we're hurting in all 5 areas, what's the best place to get started?
I thought you were going to ask me the Friday deployed one. If you're hurting in all 5 areas, it depends, because I assume you are hurting equally. I would start with the humans. What is waking your people up? Start with whatever is like leeching away their will to live, because once you start freeing up some of those, you know, once you start sleeping through the night and once they have a creative brain back, they'll be better equipped. So like your managers should be tracking the paging volume, who's getting paged, where are the pages coming from, do you guys understand what's happening, can you put adequate remediation in place, can you lower your threshold, can you decide not to care about some of these things? Maybe you just have to like offload some amount of caring to dig yourselves out of this hole.
Yeah, I definitely hear that, right? Like the idea of if your team is not happy, no amount of working on the other things is going to ever progress, right? Because you can't run a team on burnt out engineers or engineers who quit, right? So P0, like, you know, decrease the operational pain to the point that your engineers aren't feeling burnt out or unable to do work. And then even if that means compromising on the reliability of your service, right? Then the next thing I would think about addressing is kind of, okay, now we feel like we're starting to get our people situation under control. How can we get the operations of our service back under control? Are there repeat incidents? Are there things that we can do to increase understanding of the service so we can start bringing the reliability levels back up, right? And then finally, I think then you can start doing the technical debt piece. And the technical debt piece, there's a reason we put it in the middle of that wheel, The reason we put it in the middle of that wheel is because it influences all 4 of the other things. It makes it harder to do all 4 of the other things, or easier to do all 4 of the other things. So that's your highest leverage thing, but it's not necessarily your most urgent thing. Your most urgent thing is stop the burnout, stop the constant on-call fires. After that, you can focus on tech debt, and then you can kind of work on each of these 4 things in turn. The other way I like to think about it in terms of the wheel is in terms of like if you have this wheel, yeah, when you have this wheel of, you know, code, deploy, make sure it runs in production, and then look at the feedback from users, right? You can kind of work your way around that wheel. Every time that you have one thing that's kind of, you know, holding you back, right? You know, then you improve it. And then you improve that until you're held back at the next step, right? Now, let's suppose your developers cannot debug their systems even in their dev environments, right? You know, so introduce better tooling for that, help them write better tests, help them, you know, test using the same tools they would in production, right? Do all that. But then if your blocker suddenly becomes, okay, now they can test well, but they can't ship to prod, it takes weeks to ship to prod, okay, now you got to work on that. Okay, now we're shipping to prod, but it's breaking in prod. Okay, now we got to work on resilience, right? Okay, now everything's resilient and stable, but we're not building the right thing, right? It loops around, right? Like just keep working on blocking, which is probably keeping your people from burning out.
Consolidate your weight behind fewer arrows. Don't try to attack all 5 at once. Attack one, knock it out of the park. Then attack the other one, knock it out of the park. No work counts until it's shipped, right? You don't get partial credit for partially fixing something if it's still waking you up. So like, make sure that you're just knocking them off one at a time instead of like going, we're gonna, like, all right, we have 5 people, each one of you gets assigned one of these problems. Like that will never result in success.
Yeah,
I really like that approach.
Like the Wordly maps that we talked about earlier, every organization's Wordly map showing where they are in each of these 5 areas will show a very different potential priority, importance/pain right now.
This could be a really fun exercise for your leadership team to do during an offsite. I did want to mention SLOs though, because SLOs are the contract that you have between engineers and management. So you're never going to get to the promised land without those.
Got that. It sounds like a really great approach to just identify your problems and take one bite at a time to start working your way towards more success in this area. And since this is a common question that I've heard many, let's releases.
Liz, you want to take this?
Sure, I'll take it. I can be a little bit more diplomatic, I think. I think that when you have a fine-tuned release process, right, like when it's regularly running, it should be an exception to turn it off, right? Why does your release process that's continuously deploying have to be turned off on a specific day? Or why do you think that if you can't catch an outage in the first 3 hours that it's deployed, why do you think that you're going to necessarily catch them the next day, right? It might explode 1 day later, 2 days later, 3 days later. At that point, right, like, you know, if you choose not to push on Fridays, you're giving up 1/5 of your velocity, right? And some other organization that's invested in the better tooling needed in order to maintain Friday deploys is going to eat your lunch. And that's the thing that, you know, spoiler alert, this is the thing that Intercom says. I think that if you haven't made that investment, you know, don't deploy on Fridays, but look at that as a symptom of something is wrong rather than I'm proud of looking after my people, right? You can be proud of looking after your people and saying, hey, stick around for long enough until you're confident, right? After that window, you know, it could go wrong at any time, and that's just normal on-call work.
Yeah, that is I am not, despite what some may think, I'm not a rabid, like, I'm not saying nobody should ever not deploy on Fridays. If that's where you're at as an organization, that's a great stopgap. That is a great temporary thing to do to make sure that your people have their weekend safe. But if that's actually, you know, if you're actually in a state where that's a reasonable thing to do, it probably means that the rest of your week is all shit, right? Now, the point is not to not deploy on Fridays. The point is to do the right thing for your organization at every stage of development. And something's very wrong if you can't safely ship on Fridays. But also differentiate between releases and deploys. Nobody's saying some big, fancy, like million lines of code feature should get shipped at Friday at 5 p.m. because that makes sense. No, that is not what we're saying. Get your flags, right? But get it in there so that you don't have to like stop everything to queue up behind a couple of big deploys Like keep the digestive system moving.
Yeah, right. Like incremental releases are so critical to this. Having adequate observability to understand when I do that incremental feature flag turn on, what are the results I'm seeing broken down by feature flag? Can you compare control and experimental groups as you go, right? Can you feel confident? And yes, I do sometimes push on Fridays, but I don't push the thing that I think is high risk on Fridays, right? It's not universal no deploy on Friday. It's be smart about it, be aware of the risks.
You want people to be using their judgment. You want to be empowering people to use good judgment, because that's how you help them build good judgment.
So I think that covers the question.
That's great. That's great. Let's move on to this one. This is assuming our familiarity with the lean startup methodology, which I think we can all understand that. Do you see, looking for a differentiation here, do you see valuability in learning metrics and running experiments? Or do you think of these as separate domains that require distinct sets of tools to work in efficiently?
It is data, dude. You actually get so much more value from having all of this in one place than by separating up and pre-optimizing for all these different things. We've been using Honeycomb for our own business logic since day one. And a lot of our happiest users are people who, it's not just the engineering team who's using it, it's support, it is product management, it is sales, it is marketing. I'm a firm believer that tools create silos. If you have a team that's using a tool and the boundary is the edge of that team and other team is using another tool, their views of reality are never going to be the same. And you get much greater than the sum of their parts if you can unify them so that everyone.
What I love about service level objectives is the way of getting the business deciders, the product managers, the engineers, the folks on call, right? Like all on one page about this is what our success criterion is, this is what the business is aiming for, and this is how we measure it, right? And I think that that's so critical. I think there is one angle that I do want to talk about. There's a reason that we talk about the 5 capabilities and why you need to evaluate where you are on each of them, right? A super ops and incident response practice does not necessarily translate into product insights, right? You may need to separately instrument for those and think about how you're going to instrument for those as you're writing the code. And the instrumentation may be slightly different, right? The use metric of a feature may be very different from this is the error rate that we're seeing and this is which requests are failing, right? Like those are different things that you're instrumenting as you go. But you put them in the same place.
Yeah.
If you put them in the same place, you can correlate them afterwards. If you don't put them in the same place, if you use disparate tools, people are jumping around between tools, that really sucks, right? So you may have to think about building the capability to instrument each of these and the capability to build the right queries for each of these. But if you make the data store the same, it kind of synergizes.
Liz, this feels like you're actually touching on one of our next questions. So let me ask this specifically. What are some specific examples of things people should be looking at, metrics or events, in order to track these outcomes, these 5 outcomes of observability? Can you touch on that?
Yeah, I can certainly touch on that. So I think that if you are not measuring the kind of SRE golden signals, right, utilization, saturation, errors, or the other one is rate, error, duration, right? Like if you're not studying these things, then your APM tool is deficient, right? Like I can flat out say that, right? Like every APM tool needs to have, rate, request rate, error rate, and latency histograms, right? If you don't have that, you're kind of flying in the dark. But I think that the better data comes from when you're able to break that down by arbitrary cardinality, where you're able to ask, for this customer, what's latency that they're seeing, even if you have 1 million customers, so that your customer success team can go and look directly at that without having to ask an engineer, right? And I think that the other dimension of kind of thinking about how do we instrument for each of these areas and kind of the success cases really goes to kind of for each of these areas, if quality code, right? Your developers have the same sense of how things are working in their dev environment as in their prod environment. For predictable release, do you understand, right? Like we released this cool open source tool called Build Events that lets you find out, how long are my builds taking? Which builds are the most prone to failing? Am I seeing a creep up in the latency distribution of this particular test, right? Like these are all questions you can answer with build events, right? So kind of using that to cut down your release cycle, I think that's really powerful. Everyone seems to understand incident response to a degree, right? Can you actually figure out what's broken in production without it taking 20 minutes to formulate a hypothesis about what's gone wrong?
I got to be shipping new custom code to describe some scenario.
New code and wait that 24-hour or 36-hour release cycle in order to get insight into your systems. You should just build it the right way from the start so you can query it when you do have a question you want to ask. So hopefully that kind of gets to the flavor of how do we approach these things? How do we kind of concretely think about the observability capability in each of these 5 areas? If that didn't answer your question, feel free to tweet at me or ask the question in the chat.
Great, thank you so much. I do want to say, I'm not sure who said that. Somebody wants to say thanks for a very helpful response, whichever one it was. So we appreciate that coming through. I'll take this one really quick. Someone has asked for details about the New York meetup and what the name is. I will put a link to that meetup, our meetup page. You can join it. I put one in recently. If you become a member of our meetup page, as soon as I have more details about where and when that's going to be, you'll get a notification. So I'll make sure that that link comes up very, very soon. And we'll turn it back to this question. Software projects are not naturally broken. They get that way over time. You probably can't improve until you break the negative feedback cycles that leads to things getting worse. How do you break those cycles?
All software is broken. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
I think that it's a question of executive will, right? Like, if you are an executive who does not care about your people, then you're going to run the organization into the ground, right? If you're an executive who does care about your people, what the tripping factor is for a lot of people waking up and realizing we cannot keep doing business as usual is when they have that outage that breaks the camel's back, right? I think the classic case there is we discovered that the government procurement process for software was broken with healthcare.gov, right? And then there was the crisis, and the crisis caused there to be enough willpower to say, you know what? We're going to fix this. We're going to fix this the right way. We're going to do it the right way. So I think kind of crises can be one trigger. New executives coming in can be another trigger. And finally, like, people realizing that they need to do this kind of DevOps and observability-driven development or full ownership model. That can also be a powerful driver for change, right? I think once someone decides to embark on change, then you kind of have to do that incremental progress, figuring out what's the minimum viable unit. Not, I'm going to smear DevOps across everything, but instead, what's the minimum viable unit? Where am I going to test this to see how it works with my organization? Which team is going to practice this first? Go ahead, Charlie.
Pain and pleasure, those are your only 2 tools. Either it hurts someone, they decide to make things change, or people get hooked on the dopamine hit if they're making things better. Those are the only 2 ways anything ever changes.
All right, awesome. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to see if we can get through this one last question. Sometimes technical debt just means we understand this better now. When deployment is not scary and regressions are easier to spot and the blast radius is limited, does this mean we can actually provide better value?
I think that's a yes-no question. I think the answer is yes, right? The more leverage you have, the less you're fighting the system, the better.
Okay. That sounds great. I'm going to call it
the open year
today. Oh, I'm sorry, Terry. Go ahead.
There's an open source question there too.
Oh, you're absolutely right. We have an open source culture. How should we make progress with observability with our own built systems?
So first of all, open source culture is one thing. Does that mean that you write or all your own tools or use open source for everything? I would push back on that. I say that's kind of a pathology at this point. However, the answer to your question is, look at how we've written the beelines. Basically, when a request enters a service, we initialize an empty event, pre-populate it with everything we know about the context throughout the life of that request in that service. You can stuff more detail into the blob, and at the end, when it exits or errors, ships that blob off as one arbitrarily wide event, structured event. Ship those into fucking, I don't know, Aurora or something, so you can slice and dice on them, and that will give you something that's
Yeah, there are a lot of great open source things that kind of do this. It's the methodology, right, of structuring your events and making sure that your backend can support indexing those structured events and querying them at runtime. That's what matters. But open source is not free. You have to pay the cost to maintain it and run it yourself. You know, that's a trade-off.
Exactly.
You have to pay your own organization. So with that.
All right. Cool. This was fun. Thanks, guys, for showing up. This was really great.
Thank you, everyone,
for the rest of the day.
Feel better soon, Charity. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and for joining us today. There's some attachments that will come through once this link is finished processing, and you'll get an email, including a white paper for a framework for the observability maturity model written by Charity and Liz. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.